Picture this, a white marble palace perched on the edge of a Greek island, its columns glowing amber in the Mediterranean sunset, gardens cascading toward the Ionian Sea, and at its heart, a towering statue of the dying Achilles, frozen in his moment of greatest vulnerability, and if these walls could speak, they would whisper the story of another kind of death, not the swift pierce of an arrow to the heel, but the slow suffocation of a woman who built this palace as her final refuge from a world that had caged her since she was 16 years old, and the question that hangs in the salt-thick air is this: what drives an empress, the most beautiful woman in Europe, a queen whose face launched not ships but 1,000 portraits, to abandon the glittering imperial court of Vienna and pour her grief, her rage, and her desperate longing for freedom into a shrine to a Greek hero on a remote hillside in Corfu? What darkness was she fleeing? What truth was she seeking in marble and myth? And why, after her violent death, did this palace, her most personal creation, become a casino, a military hospital, and a monument stripped of its soul before finally being restored to tell her story, a story far more complex and tragic than the romantic fairy tale the world wanted her to live? The Achilleion Palace is not just a building, it is a three-dimensional diary, architectural scream, a monument to the impossible paradox of being the most famous woman in the world and feeling utterly invisible, and to understand it, we must first understand her, Elisabeth Amalie Eugenie, Duchess in Bavaria, who became Elisabeth, Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary, but who the world knew simply as Sisi, a woman whose life was a study in the brutal collision between individual desire and imperial duty, between the wild spirit of a girl raised in the Bavarian countryside and the suffocating protocol of the Habsburg court, between the goddess the public worshipped and the deeply wounded human being she actually was. Born on Christmas Eve 1837 in Munich, Sisi grew up in the informal, almost bohemian household of Duke Maximilian in Bavaria and his wife Ludovica, a stark contrast to the rigid formality of most European royal courts, and young Elizabeth spent her childhood roaming the Bavarian Alps, riding horses with reckless abandon, writing poetry in hidden forest clearings, and dreaming of a life unbound by convention. And she was beautiful, achingly beautiful even as a child, with thick chestnut hair that fell past her knees, a tiny waist she would obsess over for her entire life, and eyes that seemed to hold both light and profound melancholy. Then came the summer of 1853, when everything changed, when her mother Ludovica, sister to the Habsburg Archduchess Sophie, hatched a plan to marry her eldest daughter Helene to the young Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria, and 15-year-old Sisi was dragged along to the imperial resort of Bad Ischl merely as a companion, wearing a simple black mourning dress for a recently deceased relative, her hair loose and uncurled. And the moment Franz Joseph saw her, he was transfixed, ignoring the carefully prepared Helene entirely, fixating instead on this unpolished, startled girl who had never expected to be noticed, and within 3 days, against his mother's furious objections, he had proposed to Sisi, and the girl, dazzled by the handsome young emperor, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, and too young to comprehend what she was agreeing to, said yes. The wedding took place on April 24, 1854, in Vienna's Augustinerkirche, a spectacle of imperial grandeur, and 16-year-old Sisi, draped in silk and diamonds, walked into a gilded trap, because from the moment she entered the Hofburg Palace, she ceased to be Elizabeth and became the Empress, a role with scripts, costumes, and stage directions she had never rehearsed, controlled entirely by her new mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, the true power behind the Habsburg throne, a woman of iron will who had shaped her son into an emperor and who viewed this naive Bavarian girl as an unfortunate obstacle to dynastic perfection. Sophie controlled every aspect of Sisi's life, her schedule, her clothing, her public appearances, her education in court etiquette, and most painfully, her children, because when Sisi gave birth to her first daughter Sophie in 1855 and her second daughter Gisela in 1856, Archduchess Sophie simply took them, removed them from their mother's care, appointed her own nurses and governesses, and relegated Sisi to the role of ceremonial breeding stock, and the young empress, barely 18, found herself trapped in a system designed to erase her individuality, to transform her into a porcelain doll whose only functions were to smile at state dinners, produce airs, and never, ever express an opinion. The Habsburg court was a machine of ritual, a Byzantine labyrinth of protocol where every gesture had meaning, every meal was a ceremony, every public appearance was choreographed, and Sisi, who had grown up climbing trees and reading poetry by mountain streams, was suffocating, and her body began to rebel. She developed a chronic cough, lost weight, suffered fainting spells, and court doctors diagnosed consumption or weakness of the lungs, but the real illness was despair, the slow death of the self under the weight of imperial expectations. Then came the tragedy that would fracture her forever. In 1857, Franz Joseph embarked on an official tour of Hungary and insisted that Sisi and their 2 young daughters accompany him, and during the grueling journey, both children fell ill with fever and diarrhea, and while Gisela slowly recovered, 2-year-old Sophie, the Archduchess's namesake and favorite, died in Sisi's arms in Budapest, and the young empress was shattered, consumed by guilt, rage, and the unshakable belief that her mother-in-law blamed her for taking the child on the journey, and this moment marked the beginning of Sisi's long war against the court, a decades-long struggle to reclaim her autonomy, her children, and her sense of self. She fought back in the only ways available to her. She became obsessed with her beauty, turning her body into a weapon of control, maintaining a waist measurement of just 19 inches through brutal dieting and corsetry, exercising for hours on rings and bars installed in her private apartments, washing and braiding her floor-length hair in ritualistic 3-hour sessions with her Greek hairdresser Fanny Fifelik. And she learned to use her legendary beauty as leverage, because the world was obsessed with the beautiful empress, and as long as she remained perfect, she retained a sliver of power. In 1858, she gave birth to the long-awaited male heir, Crown Prince Rudolf, and this time, hardened by loss and fury, Sisi fought her mother-in-law for custody of her own child, threatening to leave the court entirely, and for the first time, Franz Joseph sided with his wife over his mother, granting Sisi control over Rudolf's upbringing, a Pyrrhic victory that gave her one child but could not repair the fundamental incompatibility between her nature and her role. What most people never understood about Sisi was that her beauty, rather than being a gift, was a prison of its own kind, because she became a spectacle, a living work of art that the empire exhibited, and strangers felt entitled to stare at her, to comment on her appearance, to reduce her to a face and a figure, and she hated it, increasingly refusing to be photographed after the age of 30, commissioning paintings and sculptures instead so she could control her image, preserve herself at her peak of beauty, and hide the passage of time that terrified her. By the 1860s, Sisi had discovered her escape, travel, constant, relentless travel, and she became a nomad of the aristocratic world, fleeing Vienna for months at a time, riding horses in England and Ireland with reckless courage that terrified her companions, sailing the Mediterranean on her private yacht, seeking sun and sea air in Madeira, Corfu, Algeria, anywhere but the Hofburg Palace, and Franz Joseph, who genuinely loved her but could never truly understand her, simply paid the bills and waited for her increasingly rare returns. She also threw herself into the cause of Hungarian nationalism, learning the Magyar language fluently, championing Hungarian autonomy within the empire, and forming a deep alliance with the Hungarian statesman Count Gyula Andrássy, a relationship that inspired endless rumors of an affair, though the truth was likely more complex. A profound intellectual and emotional connection that gave Sisi a sense of purpose beyond mere ornamentation, and her advocacy played a role in the creation of the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, which transformed the Habsburg realm into the dual monarchy and saw Sisi crowned Queen of Hungary in a magnificent ceremony in Budapest, one of the few moments when she seemed to embrace her imperial role, because in Hungary she was celebrated not just for her beauty but for her political influence and her genuine affection for the Magyar people. But even this triumph could not fill the void, and by the 1880s, Sisi's restlessness had evolved into something darker, a fascination with death, a romantic obsession with tragedy, and a deepening identification with wounded, doomed heroes from literature and mythology, particularly Heinrich Heine, whose poems about exile and suffering she memorized, and Lord Byron, whose rebellious spirit and early death in Greece resonated with her own sense of being trapped, and most significantly, Achilles, the greatest warrior of Greek myth, who was both invincible and fatally vulnerable, both godlike and ultimately mortal, a perfect mirror for an empress who was worshipped as a beauty goddess but felt her power and her life slowly draining away. In 1885, during one of her many voyages to the Mediterranean, Sisi visited Corfu for the first time, drawn by its Greek history, its wild landscapes, and its distance from the imperial obligations of Vienna, and she fell in love with the island immediately, particularly with a hillside location called the Estate of the Philosopher, offering panoramic views of the Ionian Sea, the Albanian mountains, and lush olive groves, and it was here, she decided, that she would build her retreat, her personal sanctuary, a place designed entirely according to her own vision, free from the input of architects or advisors, a palace that would be hers alone, and she would dedicate it to Achilles, the hero whose story of glory and doom mirrored her own. The decision to build the Achilleion was not just architectural whimsy, it was an act of defiance and self-expression, a woman who had been denied control over her own life for decades finally creating a space where she could materialize her inner world, her obsessions, her grief, her intellectual passions, and her unspoken rage, and the palace would become a physical manifestation of Sisi's psyche, beautiful, melancholic, fixated on death, and steeped in classical learning. Construction began in 1889, and Sisi hired Italian architect Raffaele Corriddo, but make no mistake, she was the true architect, dictating every detail, rejecting plans that didn't match her vision, insisting on specific mythological themes, and she wanted a palace that was intimate, not a massive imperial showcase, something more like a large villa than a Versailles-style behemoth, with colonnaded terraces, frescoed ceilings, and gardens designed to evoke ancient Greece. The location itself required significant engineering. The hillside had to be terraced and stabilized, water systems had to be installed where none existed, roads had to be built to transport materials from Corfu town, and an army of local laborers, Corfiot peasants who earned meager wages for backbreaking work, carved the foundations into the rocky slope, hauled marble blocks up the steep paths, and planted the thousands of trees, palms, cypresses, and oleanders that would transform the barren hilltop into a romantic paradise, and these men and women, whose names were never recorded, whose struggles were never celebrated, built an empress's dream with their hands and their sweat while she remained a distant, enigmatic figure overseeing her monument. Sisi filled the palace with art that revealed her inner life. The entrance hall was dominated by a massive fresco depicting Achilles' triumphant return from the Trojan War, a moment of glory, but as you moved deeper into the palace, the narrative darkened, because Sisi was more interested in Achilles' death than his victories, more fascinated by vulnerability than invincibility, and in the gardens, she commissioned a massive bronze statue by German sculptor Ernst Herder titled The Dying Achilles, depicting the hero in his final moments, collapsing, one hand reaching back to the arrow lodged in his heel, his face twisted in agony and disbelief, and Sisi would spend hours sitting before this statue, staring at it, perhaps seeing in his doomed heroism a reflection of her own fate, a premonition of her own violent end. Inside, the palace was a riot of neoclassical motifs, Pompeian-style frescoes, marble statues of Greek gods and muses, walls adorned with quotes from Homer and other classical poets, and Sisi's private apartments were comparatively austere, because she had no interest in Habsburg opulence. She wanted beauty, yes, but beauty that meant something. Beauty tied to ideas, to literature, to the ancient world she idealized as a place of freedom and heroic action, so different from the stifling modernity of Vienna. But even as she built her refuge, tragedy continued to stalk her. In 1889, the same year the Achilleion's construction began, her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in an apparent murder-suicide pact with his teenage mistress Baroness Mary Vetsera at the hunting lodge of Mayerling. And the official story was suicide, but rumors swirled of political conspiracy, and regardless of the truth, Rudolf's death destroyed the last remnants of Sisi's already fragile emotional stability, because she had poured so much hope into him, groomed him as a liberal reformer who might modernize the empire, and his death meant the succession would pass to Franz Joseph's nephew, the conservative Franz Ferdinand, ensuring that the empire she had never loved would continue unchanged. Sisi descended into deep mourning, dressing in unrelenting black for the remaining 9 years of her life, and the Achilleion, which was supposed to be a joyful retreat, became instead a mausoleum for her grief, a place where she wandered the terraces alone, staring out at the sea, writing dark poetry, and contemplating mortality. She visited Corfu only a handful of times between 1890 and 1898, and even when she was there, she seemed more ghost than empress, a thin, restless figure dressed in black, her famous hair now streaked with grey, her beauty hardening into something almost spectral, and the palace, despite its beauty, could not give her peace, because peace was not something architecture could provide to a woman whose wounds were so deep. The household staff at the Achilleion, like those at all of Sisi's residences, existed in a strange limbo. They served a mistress who was rarely present, who had no interest in social entertaining, and who, when she did appear, often wanted to be left entirely alone, and the Greek servants, hired locally, must have found this Austrian empress and her death-obsessed palace deeply strange, but they kept the gardens manicured, the marble polished, and the statues gleaming, maintaining a monument to a woman who was already haunting her own creation. By 1898, Sisi was 60 years old, still beautiful but worn down by decades of grief, rebellion, and the exhausting effort of maintaining her famous beauty regimen, and she was traveling again, this time to Switzerland, staying incognito in Geneva under a false name, accompanied only by a single lady-in-waiting, Countess Irma Stare, and on September 10, 1898, as she walked along the Geneva waterfront toward a steamship, a 25-year-old Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini, who had come to Geneva hoping to assassinate a different royal but found them absent, spotted Sisi, recognized her despite her attempts at anonymity, and decided she would do, because to men like Lucchini, drunk on anarchist ideology, any aristocrat was a legitimate target, a symbol of oppression to be struck down, and he approached her with a small, sharpened file hidden in his hand, and in a single, almost casual motion, he stabbed her directly in the heart. The wound was so precise, so small, that Sisi barely felt it. She stumbled, regained her footing, and even boarded the steamship, confused but not panicking, and only when she collapsed on deck did the truth become clear, and by the time they rushed her back to her hotel, she was dead, her famous beauty finally still, her long quest for escape complete, and the news of her assassination shook Europe, because Sisi, despite her reclusiveness, remained an icon, the beautiful, tragic empress, and her death by anarchist violence seemed to confirm the fears of the aristocratic classes that the old order was under siege from forces that respected neither rank nor beauty. Franz Joseph, who had loved her for 44 years despite never truly understanding her, was devastated, and the empire mourned, but the question remained, what would happen to her palace, the Achilleion, the place she had built as a refuge from the world but had never truly inhabited? For several years, the palace sat empty, a strange monument maintained by a skeleton staff, too personal to be an official imperial residence, too remote to be useful, and in 1907, Franz Joseph, perhaps unable to bear the memories or simply recognizing the impracticality, sold the Achilleion to the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, a man whose personality was the polar opposite of Sisi's. Bombastic, militaristic, obsessed with projecting power, and Wilhelm saw in the Achilleion not a melancholic shrine, but a strategic Mediterranean base and a stage for his own ego. Wilhelm immediately set about correcting Sisi's vision, and in his mind, her obsession with the dying Achilles was too weak, too feminine, too focused on vulnerability, so he commissioned a new statue from German sculptor Johannes Gotz, Achilles Victorious, a towering bronze depicting Achilles in full armor, standing triumphantly over the body of Hector, radiating masculine dominance. And Wilhelm installed this statue on the terrace in a position even more prominent than Sisi's dying hero, effectively staging a dialogue between two visions of heroism, the tragic and the triumphant, the feminine and the masculine, and the palace that had been a space for mourning and introspection became a stage for imperial bravado. Wilhelm used the Achilleion as a summer retreat and a place to receive dignitaries, hosting lavish parties and military displays, and he added his own touches, a Teutonic inscription over the entrance praising valor, and he renamed parts of the gardens, and the palace, once suffused with Sisi's melancholy, now echoed with military marches and the clinking of champagne glasses as European aristocrats and diplomats danced on the edge of the volcano, because these years, 1907 to 1914, were the last golden summer of the old European order, the final breath before the cataclysm of World War I. When war erupted in 1914, the Achilleion, perched on neutral Greek soil, owned by the now-enemy German Kaiser, became an awkward political problem, and Greece, under pressure, eventually confiscated the property as enemy property, and during the war, the palace served various utilitarian functions: a military hospital for wounded soldiers, a government office, a storage facility, and the gardens that Sisi had carefully designed were trampled by boots, the frescoes on the walls faded from neglect, and the statues, both Sisi's dying Achilles and Wilhelm's triumphant version, stared at each other across the terrace, witnesses to the collapse of the world that had created them, because the war destroyed the old European aristocracy, toppled empires, and rendered obsolete the kind of dynastic grandeur the Achilleion represented. After the war, the palace languished in legal limbo for years, claimed by the Greek state but with no clear purpose, too expensive to maintain properly, too historically significant to demolish, and by the 1920s, it had become a bizarre tourist attraction and, most astonishingly, a casino, because a Greek businessman leased the property from the state and transformed Sisi's shrine to Achilles and her temple of melancholy into a gambling hall where wealthy tourists played roulette and baccarat. Beneath frescoes of Greek heroes, and the tragic irony was almost too perfect, the woman who had built this palace to escape the superficiality and cruelty of high society would have watched in horror as her most personal creation became a playground for the idle rich, a place where fortunes were won and lost on the spin of a wheel in rooms she had designed for contemplation and poetry. The casino operated through the 1930s, and during World War II, the Achilleion was occupied by Italian and then German forces, who used it as military headquarters, and the palace that had been built by an Austrian empress, sold to a German Kaiser, confiscated by the Greeks, and turned into a casino now served the Axis war machine. And one wonders what the ghosts of Sisi and Achilles thought of the soldiers smoking in the hallways and the officers planning operations in the gardens. After World War II, the palace was in terrible condition, looted, damaged, neglected, and the Greek state took full ownership but lacked the resources to restore it, and for decades, from the 1950s through the 1980s, the Achilleion existed in a state of semi-ruin, open to tourists who wandered through faded rooms, past chipped statues, and overgrown gardens, taking photographs and buying postcards. But the palace had lost its meaning, become a curiosity, a set piece, most famously used in 1981. As a filming location for the James Bond movie, For Your Eyes Only, where it doubled as a villain's casino headquarters, which was grimly appropriate given its actual history. But something began to shift in the 1990s and 2000s, as historical scholarship on Sisi deepened and a new generation of curators and historians began to take the Achilleion seriously not just as a tourist attraction but as a historical document, a three-dimensional autobiography of one of the most complex and tragic figures of the 19th century, and restoration efforts began in earnest. Funded by the Greek government and European heritage grants, and experts worked to undo decades of neglect, restoring frescoes, stabilizing the structure, researching Sisi's original design intentions, and most importantly, beginning to tell her story, the real story, not the sanitized fairy tale of the beautiful empress but the darker, richer truth of a woman who was trapped, who fought back in the limited ways available to her, who built a palace as an act of self-expression and self-preservation, and who was ultimately murdered by the very world she tried to escape. The restoration also involved reckoning with the palace's layered history, Sisi's original vision, Wilhelm's militaristic alterations, the casino years, the wartime occupations, and the question became how to present all of these layers honestly, and the decision was made to preserve both Achilles statues, the dying and the triumphant, as representations of two conflicting visions of heroism and power, and to interpret the palace not as a single frozen moment but as a space that had been contested, reimagined, and misused over a century, which made it a richer and more truthful historical site. Modern scholarship on Sisi, aided by access to her private letters, diaries, and poetry, has revealed the depths of her intellectual life, her struggles with depression and disordered eating, her complex views on politics and nationhood, and her profound alienation from the role she was forced to play, and the Achilleion, when viewed through this lens, becomes legible as a text, a place where she tried to communicate her inner world to an audience that mostly wasn't listening, because the world wanted her to be beautiful and silent, and she complied in public while screaming in marble and bronze in private. The palace's gardens, carefully restored, reveal Sisi's obsession with physical fitness and natural beauty, because she had pathways designed for her long daily walks, and she exercised obsessively to maintain the figure that was both her power and her prison, and the gardens were also a place of solitude, where she could escape even the minimal staff she employed, and the olive trees and cypresses she planted, many of which still stand, were witnesses to her solitary vigils. One of the most poignant aspects of the Achilleion story is how invisible Sisi made herself even as she built a monument to her own psyche. Because she refused to be painted or photographed in her later years, she traveled under pseudonyms, she avoided state functions whenever possible, and even at the Achilleion, she often kept the shutters closed and the curtains drawn, creating a paradox. A palace of light and classical beauty inhabited by a woman who craved darkness and anonymity, and this tension is palpable when you visit the restored palace today, because the spaces are designed to be open and airy, with colonnades that frame spectacular views, yet you can feel the weight of her melancholy, the sense that these beautiful rooms were stages for a performance of selfhood that exhausted the performer. The story of the Achilleion is also a story about the limits of wealth and power to provide happiness or even safety. Because Sisi had access to unlimited resources, she could build palaces, travel the world, commission art, and surround herself with beauty, yet none of it could heal the wounds inflicted by her mother-in-law's cruelty, the death of her children, the suffocating protocol of the Habsburg court, or the relentless objectification of her beauty, and in the end, her wealth and status made her a target, and an impoverished anarchist with a sharpened file ended her life in seconds, proving that palaces, however beautiful, offer no real protection. The palace also raises uncomfortable questions about labor and class, because while we romanticize Sisi's aesthetic vision and sympathize with her suffering, the Achilleion was built by Corfiot workers who had no stake in her personal drama, who labored for wages that barely sustained their families, who terraced the hillside and hauled the marble and planted the gardens so that an Austrian empress could have a retreat from her luxurious unhappiness, and there is a moral dissonance here, a reminder that beauty and privilege are almost always built on invisible labor, and the restoration of the Achilleion, to its credit, now includes interpretation of the servant quarters, the kitchens, and the working infrastructure of the estate, an attempt to make visible the people who were always there but never acknowledged. Furthermore, Sisi's story, and by extension the Achilleion story, is deeply intertwined with the political violence and ideological upheavals of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, because her death was not a random act of madness but a political assassination rooted in anarchist ideology, which viewed aristocrats as symbols of oppression, and the fact that Licini chose Sisi essentially at random, knowing nothing about her except her title, underscores the depersonalization inherent in political violence, the way individuals become mere signifiers, and the Achilleion, with its references to ancient heroes and tragic fates, inadvertently became a monument to this modern tragedy as well. The Kaiser's alterations to the palace reveal another dimension of historical interpretation, because Wilhelm's decision to install the triumphant Achilles was not just personal taste but a political statement, a reassertion of masculine, militaristic values against what he perceived as Sisi's feminine melancholy. And the fact that both statues remain today, coexisting uneasily on the same terrace, serves as a powerful reminder that historical sites are not neutral, they are battlegrounds where different ideologies and worldviews clash, and the challenge for modern curators is to present these conflicts honestly rather than smoothing them over into a coherent narrative. The use of the Achilleion as a casino in the interwar period, while it seems almost farcical, is actually a deeply symbolic moment in the palace's history, because it represents the commodification and trivialization of aristocratic culture after the collapse of the old order, and the aristocracy, which had once controlled vast empires, was now reduced to renting out its palaces as entertainment venues, and the sacred spaces of personal grief and imperial ambition became backdrops for bourgeois leisure, and there is a certain poetic justice in this, a leveling, but also a profound loss, because it meant that the specific meanings Sisi had embedded in the palace were overwritten and forgotten. The military occupations during both world wars further layered the palace with meaning, because spaces designed for aesthetic contemplation became spaces of strategic planning, and the gardens where Sisi walked alone were patrolled by sentries, and this transformation underscores the vulnerability of cultural heritage during wartime. The way that art and architecture become collateral damage or appropriated for purposes utterly alien to their creators' intentions. The Bond film usage in 1981, while trivial in some ways, is also revealing, because it shows how the Achilleion, stripped of its specific historical context, could be reduced to a generic signifier of exotic luxury, a pretty backdrop for an action sequence, and this is the fate of many historical sites in the age of mass tourism and media. They become images, divorced from their stories, consumed visually but not understood, and the challenge of the restoration has been to resist this reduction, to insist that the Achilleion is not just a pretty place but a place with a specific, complex, and deeply human story. Modern visitors to the Achilleion, which reopened as a fully restored museum in the 2000s, encounter multiple narratives. They see Sisi's original vision in the frescoes and the dying Achilles statue, they see Wilhelm's triumphalist edition, they read about the casino years and the wartime occupations, and they are invited to reflect on the layers of history, the way that a single place can mean different things to different people across time, and the palace, which Sisi intended as a private refuge, has become a public space for historical reflection, which is perhaps a transformation she would have hated, but it is also the only way her story, and the stories embedded in the palace, can continue to be told. One of the most powerful aspects of visiting the Achilleion today is standing before the statue of the dying Achilles and recognizing it as Sisi's self-portrait, not a literal one, but an emotional and psychological one, because she saw herself as fatally wounded by circumstances beyond her control, brought down not by lack of courage or beauty but by an inherent vulnerability, the heel, in her case being her sensitivity, her inability to conform, her refusal to be merely ornamental, and the statue, with Achilles reaching back toward the arrow, captures that awful moment of realization that the wound is mortal, that there is no escape, and one imagines Sisi sitting before it, recognizing her own fate. The palace's location on Corfu is also significant, because Greece, for 19th-century romantics like Sisi, represented an idealized past, a world of heroic action, poetic beauty, and tragic nobility, utterly unlike the bureaucratic modernity of the Habsburg Empire, and by building her palace in Greece, Sisi was not just escaping Vienna geographically but attempting to escape her own era, to live, however briefly, in the world of myth, and this backward-looking impulse, this desire to retreat into an idealized past, is itself a symptom of modernity's discontents, a recognition that the present is unbearable and the future offers no hope, and the only solace is in stories of ancient heroes who, though they died gloriously, on their own terms, and Sisi's obsession with these myths was a way of rewriting her own narrative, of transforming her suffering from meaningless to tragic, and therefore, in some strange way, meaningful. The Achilleion's terraces, with their sweeping views of the Ionian Sea, were designed for contemplation, and Sisi would spend hours there, looking out toward Albania, toward the horizon, and one wonders what she thought about during those long silences, whether she found the peace she sought or whether the beauty of the landscape only intensified her sense of being trapped, because beautiful views can be a comfort or a torment, depending on whether you are free to enjoy them, and Sisi, despite her palaces and her yachts and her ability to travel the world, was never truly free, always shadowed by her title, her duties, the expectations of the court, and the relentless public fascination with her appearance. The restoration of the Achilleion in the 21st century is also a story about how societies choose to remember and interpret the past, because the decision to invest significant resources in restoring a palace built by a troubled empress for her own private use reflects a belief that individual stories matter, that understanding the psychological and emotional lives of historical figures enriches our understanding of history itself, and the Achilleion, as a site of public memory, now serves as a reminder that history is not just about kings and battles and treaties but also about inner lives, about how people coped with suffering, about what it meant to be trapped by circumstances, and about the human need to create, to build, to leave a mark, even when, or especially when, life feels unbearable. Sisi's relationship with her own beauty is one of the most complex and tragic aspects of her story, because she understood that her beauty was her currency, the one thing that gave her leverage in the court, but she also hated it, hated being reduced to an object, hated the constant scrutiny, and her extreme beauty regimen, the hours of exercise, the starvation diets, the hair-washing rituals, were both an attempt to maintain her power and a form of self-harm, a way of punishing her body for being the thing that trapped her, and the Achilleion, with its emphasis on classical beauty, on perfect proportions, on idealized human forms, can be read as an extension of this obsession, a way of externalizing her impossible standards, of creating a world of perfect beauty that she could control, unlike her own appearance, which was subject to aging and decay and the world's judgment. The poems and quotes Sisi had inscribed on the walls of the Achilleion, drawn from Homer and other classical sources, reveal her intellectual depth and her desire to be seen as more than just a beautiful face, because she was well-read, fluent in several languages, a talented poet in her own right, and she wanted the palace to be a testament to her mind as well as her taste. But the cruel irony is that for most of her life, and indeed for decades after her death, the world ignored her intellect and her writing, remembered her only for her beauty and her tragic end, and it was only through the painstaking work of historians in the late 20th century, excavating her journals and letters, that the full complexity of her inner life began to be appreciated, and the Achilleion's restoration included a renewed focus on these literary aspects, an attempt to honor the woman she wanted to be, not just the icon the world made her. The relationship between Sisi and Franz Joseph is one of the great tragic love stories of history, not because it was romantic in the conventional sense, but because it was a study in mutual incomprehension and genuine affection existing side by side, because Franz Joseph loved her deeply, remained faithful to her despite her long absences, supported her financially without question, and mourned her for the rest of his life, but he could never give her what she truly needed, which was freedom from the very system he embodied, and Sisi, for her part, seems to have retained some affection for him, recognizing that he was as trapped by his role as she was by hers, but she could not live with him, could not breathe in the court he ruled, and so they existed in a strange, sad compromise, married but mostly apart, bound by duty and history but unable to truly share a life. The fate of their son Rudolf adds another layer of tragedy, because Rudolf, who Sisi had hoped would be the enlightened reformer the empire needed, was himself a troubled man, caught between his liberal ideals and the conservative reality of the court, between his father's expectations and his mother's emotional remoteness, and his death at Mayerling, whatever the exact circumstances, was a symbol of the empire's rot. The sense that the next generation was doomed, that the old order could not be reformed, only endured until it collapsed, and Sisi's retreat to the Achilleion after Rudolf's death was an acknowledgement of this hopelessness, a recognition that there was no future worth fighting for, only a present to be endured and a past to be mourned. The story of the Achilleion also illuminates the role of women in the 19th century aristocracy, because Sisi's struggle was not unique. Many aristocratic women were trapped in gilded cages, valued for their bloodlines and their ability to produce heirs, denied education, political power, or personal autonomy, and while Sisi's beauty and position made her case extreme, it was representative of a broader system of gender oppression that treated women as property, and her rebellion, such as it was, consisted of the limited tools available to her, controlling her body, traveling, building a palace, writing poetry, all indirect forms of resistance because direct resistance, political action, was impossible for a woman of her class and era, and the Achilleion stands as a monument to this constrained agency, a woman making her mark the only way she could. The palace's afterlife as a casino and then a tourist attraction and film location speaks to the broader commodification of aristocratic heritage in the 20th century, because as the political and economic power of the aristocracy waned, their cultural capital became their most valuable asset, and palaces that had been private spaces became public attractions, sources of revenue. And this transformation was both democratizing, because it allowed ordinary people access to spaces that had once been exclusive, and cheapening, because it stripped those spaces of their original meanings and functions, turned them into products to be consumed, and the challenge for sites like the Achilleion is to balance the economic necessity of tourism with the ethical and intellectual responsibility to tell true, complex stories, and the recent restoration has attempted this balance, creating a visitor experience that is both accessible and historically rigorous. that allows people to appreciate the beauty while also understanding the suffering, the privilege, and the politics embedded in the stones. The two Achilles statues, the dying and the triumphant, standing on the same terrace, create a powerful visual and conceptual tension, because they represent not just two interpretations of a mythological hero but two worldviews, two responses to mortality: Sisi's embrace of vulnerability, her identification with the wounded, and Wilhelm's insistence on strength and victory, his rejection of weakness. And the fact that neither statue has been removed, that both are preserved and interpreted, reflects a mature approach to historical memory, an acknowledgement that history is contested, that different people saw the world differently, and that the job of a historical site is not to present a single, sanitized narrative but to preserve the complexity, the arguments, the layered meanings. The Achilleion's gardens, now fully restored, are a space of almost unbearable beauty, with flowering plants, ancient trees, and carefully designed vistas, and walking through them, one can almost feel Sisi's presence. Imagine her pacing the gravel paths, her long black dress trailing, her mind churning with poetry and grief, and the gardens are a reminder that beauty can be a form of expression, a way of shaping the world according to one's inner vision, but also that beauty, no matter how perfectly executed, cannot heal certain kinds of wounds, cannot substitute for love or freedom or purpose, and the gardens, for all their loveliness, were a beautiful prison, which is perhaps what makes them so poignant. The servants and workers who maintained the Achilleion during Sisi's lifetime were, like servants everywhere in the aristocratic world, essential but invisible, and we know almost nothing about them. Their names are lost, their experiences unrecorded, and this erasure is a reminder of the fundamental inequality of the system, because Sisi's suffering, real as it was the suffering of a woman with immense privilege, a woman who could build a palace to process her grief, while the people who built and maintained that palace had their own griefs, their own struggles, and no resources to memorialize them, and any honest reckoning with the Achilleion must acknowledge this disparity, must recognize that the beauty we admire was created by people whose labor we do not see, and this is a pattern that extends far beyond this one palace. It is the pattern of history itself, the way that grand narratives erase ordinary lives, and the restoration's inclusion of information about the working life of the palace is a small step toward correcting this, toward making visible what was always there but never acknowledged. Sisi's assassination by an anarchist is also worth examining more closely, because Luigi Lucchini was not insane, he was a political actor, however misguided, and his act was rooted in a coherent, if extreme, ideology that viewed the aristocracy as parasites whose wealth was extracted from the labor of the poor, and while we can condemn his violence and mourn Sisi's death, we cannot dismiss his critique entirely, because the Europe of the late 19th century was a place of stark inequality, where aristocrats lived in unimaginable luxury while millions struggled in poverty, where inherited privilege determined life chances, and where the political system was designed to preserve the power of the few, and anarchism, with its emphasis on dismantling hierarchies and redistributing power, was a response to this injustice, however brutal its methods, and Sisi's death, tragic as it was part of a larger wave of political violence that included the assassinations of kings, presidents, and prime ministers, a wave that signaled the old order's loss of legitimacy, and the Achilleion, as a monument to aristocratic privilege, is also, inevitably, a monument to the system that anarchists sought to destroy, and this tension is part of its historical significance. The restoration of the Achilleion in the 21st century also coincides with a broader cultural moment of re-examining historical narratives, particularly narratives about women, and Sisi has become a figure of feminist interest, not because she was a feminist in any modern sense, she had no interest in women's suffrage or social reform, but because her struggle to maintain autonomy within a system designed to control her, her resistance to objectification, and her insistence on her own intellectual and emotional life resonate with contemporary concerns about gender, agency, and the male gaze, and the Achilleion, as the most complete expression of her inner world, has become a site for exploring these themes, for asking what it meant to be a woman in her position, what forms of resistance were possible, and what it cost her. The palace's use of classical mythology is also revealing, because myths are not just stories, they are ways of understanding the world, and Sisi's identification with Achilles suggests that she saw her life as inherently tragic, that she believed her suffering was fated, part of a larger pattern, and this fatalism was both a comfort, because it made her pain meaningful, part of a grand narrative, and a trap, because it foreclosed the possibility of change, of escaping the pattern. And the Achilleion, saturated with mythological imagery, becomes a space where Sisi enacted this tragic worldview, where she could be the protagonist of her own myth, and the statue of the dying Achilles is the moment of climax, the moment when the hero falls, and Sisi's long hours sitting before that statue can be understood as a form of rehearsal, preparing herself for her own inevitable end, which came, as perhaps she knew it would, violently and unexpectedly. The question of legacy is central to the Achilleion story, because Sisi built the palace as a personal refuge, with no thought that it would become a public memorial, and yet that is exactly what it has become, and the irony is that the woman who spent her life avoiding public scrutiny, who refused to be photographed, who hid behind veils and pseudonyms, is now endlessly scrutinized, her private thoughts published, her palace dissected by historians, and in a sense, the restoration and public interpretation of the Achilleion is a continuation of the violation she experienced in life, the refusal to let her be private, but it is also an act of remembrance and respect, an insistence that her story matters, that her suffering was real, and that the palace she created is valuable not just as beautiful architecture but as a window into a human soul. The Achilleion today functions as a mirror, reflecting back to us our own assumptions about beauty, wealth, power, and suffering, and when visitors walk through its rooms and gardens, they bring their own projections. Some see a romantic tragedy, some see a cautionary tale about the limits of privilege, some see a feminist icon, some see a mentally ill woman, and all of these interpretations have some validity. Because Sisi was all of these things and none of them, she was a complex human being who cannot be reduced to a single narrative, and the palace, with its layered history and its multiple meanings, resists simplification, invites us to sit with complexity and ambiguity, which is uncomfortable but ultimately more truthful than any tidy conclusion. The parallels between Sisi's time and our own are striking, because we live in an age of intense visual culture, where appearance is constantly scrutinized, where social media creates a new form of the male gaze, where women are still judged primarily on their looks, where the pressure to maintain an impossible standard of beauty drives widespread disordered eating and mental health crises, and Sisi's struggle with these pressures, over a century ago, feels startlingly contemporary, and the Achilleion, as a monument to her attempt to control her own image and escape the objectifying gaze, speaks to our moment, reminds us that these are not new problems but deeply rooted patterns that require systemic solutions, not just individual resilience. The palace also raises questions about the ethics of historical preservation, because to preserve the Achilleion is to preserve a monument to aristocratic privilege, to spend public money maintaining a space that was built for the private pleasure of one extremely wealthy woman, and this is a choice, a statement about what kinds of history we value. And the argument for preservation is that the Achilleion is valuable not because it celebrates aristocracy but because it documents it, because it allows us to study and understand a system that no longer exists, and because Sisi's story, despite her privilege, is a human story of suffering and resilience that transcends class, and the palace, properly interpreted, can be a tool for critical thinking, a way of examining privilege and power rather than simply celebrating it. The role of Greece in Sisi's imagination is also worth considering, because Greece, for 19th-century Europeans, was a fantasy space, a projection screen for their own desires and anxieties, and the actual Greece, with its own complex history and contemporary struggles, was often ignored in favor of an idealized ancient Greece, and Sisi's Achilleion is very much a product of this romantic Hellenism. An Austrian empress building a fantasy Greece on Corfu land, employing Corfu workers to realize her vision of a classical past that bore little relation to the Corfu present, and there is a colonial dimension to this, a sense of appropriation, and the restoration of the Achilleion, done by the Greek state, is also an act of reclaiming the palace, of integrating it into Greek heritage and interpreting it through a Greek lens, which adds yet another layer to its complex history. The Achilleion's survival through a century of war, political upheaval, and economic change is itself remarkable, because many similar palaces were destroyed, looted, or left to decay beyond repair, and the fact that the Achilleion still stands, still functions as a museum and historical site, is due to a combination of luck, geographical remoteness, and the decisions of various governments and individuals to invest in its preservation, and each of these decisions was an argument that the palace mattered, that its story deserved to be told, and the fact that the Greek state, despite limited resources, chose to restore the palace in the 1990s and 2000s reflects a belief that cultural heritage, even problematic heritage, has value. The experience of visiting the Achilleion today is a layered one, because you move through spaces designed for private melancholy that are now crowded with tourists, you stand before statues that meant something profound to Sisi while listening to the chatter of tour groups, and there is a dissonance here, a sense that the palace's meaning has been inevitably diluted by its transformation into a tourist attraction. But this is the paradox of all historical preservation: to save something, you must share it, and to share it is to change it, and the best that can be done is to provide context, to educate visitors, to encourage them to see beyond the pretty surfaces to the complex stories beneath, and the Achilleion, with its excellent modern interpretation, does this better than many similar sites. The story of Empress Sisi and her palace is ultimately a story about the impossibility of escape, because Sisi tried everything, traveled the world, built palaces, threw herself into causes, controlled her body with obsessive discipline, wrote poetry, immersed herself in mythology, and none of it freed her from the fundamental trap of her identity, the fact that she was born into a system that valued her only as an ornament and a breeder, and the Achilleion, her most ambitious attempt at creating a space of freedom, became instead another kind of monument, a beautiful cage that she could not truly inhabit, and her assassination on a Geneva waterfront, far from her palace, far from Vienna, disguised and traveling incognito, was the final proof that there was no escape, that the system she fled would find her anywhere, and the palace she left behind stands as a testament to this doomed effort. And walking through it today, one can almost hear the echo of her footsteps on the marble floors, the rustle of her black dress, the silence of her grief, and the Achilleion, for all its beauty, is a haunted place, haunted by the ghost of a woman who was never allowed to be herself, who built a temple to a dying hero because she saw her own fate reflected in his wound, and the palace's survival, its transformation from private refuge to public museum, is both a betrayal of her desire for privacy and a vindication of her belief that suffering, when given form, when embodied in art and architecture, can transcend the individual and speak to something universal, can become a story that endures, and so the Achilleion stands, on its hillside in Corfu, looking out over the Ionian Sea, a monument to beauty and despair, to privilege and powerlessness, to the human need to build and the inevitable decay of all things built, and to the life of Elisabeth, Empress of Austria, Queen of Hungary, called Sisi, who was the most beautiful woman in Europe and one of the most unhappy, who built a palace to escape the world and found that the world followed her even there, who identified with a dying hero and met her own violent end, and whose story, told through the marble and bronze and frescoes of the Achilleion, is a reminder that history is not just about empires and wars but about individual lives, about how people cope with suffering, about what it means to be trapped, and about the small, defiant acts of self-expression that allow us to say, even in the face of overwhelming forces, I was here, I felt this, I made this, and it matters, and the Achilleion, restored and interpreted for a new century, now stands as a space where we can contemplate these questions, where we can see both the fairy tale and the dark truth, where we can honor Sisi's suffering without ignoring her privilege, where we can appreciate the beauty while acknowledging the invisible labor that created it, and where we can recognize in her story, across the gulf of more than a century, something that still resonates, the struggle to be seen as a full human being, the desire for freedom, the weight of expectation, the cruelty of objectification, and the ultimate fragility of life, which no amount of beauty or wealth or power can protect, and in this way, the Achilleion becomes more than just a palace, more than just a museum, it becomes a place of reflection, a space where history and the present intersect, where we can think about who we are, what we value, and what legacies we will leave behind, and as you stand on the terrace, looking out at the same view Sisi saw, the sea stretching to the horizon, the Albanian mountains purple in the distance, the gardens blooming around you, you can feel the layers of time, the empress in her black dress, the Kaiser with his military entourage, the wounded soldiers in their hospital beds, the gamblers at their roulette tables, the soldiers planning war, the tourists with their cameras, and yourself, standing in this moment, trying to make sense of it all, and the Achilleion, silent and enduring, offers no easy answers, only the invitation to look, to listen, to feel. And to remember that every beautiful thing has a story, and every story, if you dig deep enough, is complicated, and that is what makes it true, and that is what makes it worth telling.